5 o'clock on Tuesday evening, November 19th. Actually, my daughter's birthday today. So, happy birthday, Alexandria. But anyway, we're here tonight to talk about preparing your first offer. So last week, Brett and Amanda, I believe, covered buyer consultation. So hopefully you prepared your customers to know what to expect when it comes time to make an offer. So what I did was I just kind of took an example out of the MLS of a property, and surprisingly enough, actually, it was Kim Pinnell's listing. So one of our office's listings that I just chose at random. So that's pretty cool that we have that many listings out there, that this one just popped up. So 3214 Amanda Street in Punta Gorda, you've taken your customer out, you've shown them the property. Hopefully you've discussed what the market is doing in that neighborhood. So if some of the things you're going to need to prepare the offer, what I would always do is go in and make sure you grab a copy of the current listing in the MLS, so that you have a copy for a few reasons. So you can refer to it as you're preparing the listing, or the offer. And then also in the agent compensation area, you'll have a record of what's being offered out. Just in the unlikely event that the compensation that's shown up on your closing statement, preliminary closing statement, isn't correct, you can always go back to this. So you should always have a copy of this to retain in your file in case you need to go back to it to check and see what the compensation was supposed to be. The other thing that we should always have available is if you go down to the link over here, let me move this chart. If you go down to this active link on the MLS data sheet, that is actually the parcel ID number. So you should make reference to that, and it's good to have that information available for a few reasons. But simplest thing is the legal description down here is something you're going to want to cut and paste onto your purchase contract. So I would have this available as well. And it doesn't hurt to print this out and keep a copy of it in your file as well. The other way to go about doing that is to, you could go to Charlotte County, the local property appraiser in each county is going to have a website. So if you go to, in this case, CC Appraiser, the Charlotte County's property appraiser website, go to record search, and we're going to do a search for this property address, which is 3214 Amanda. And this is going to be the property record on the property appraiser's website. You can also get the legal description down at the bottom here, down here from this, and cut and paste that into the property record. One of the things that you should probably pay attention to on here is, it's got this history of sales on here, so you might want to go to the last sale, which is right here. There's an active link again, that you can click on that and make sure that the property owner of record agrees. Like on here, it says Mr. Kevin E. Graham. You want to make sure that that's consistent with what's on the property record itself, because this is actually a governing document. So you want to make sure that this warranty deed, this information, is the seller of record that you're going to put on your contract. You might not always agree with the property record itself, because somebody might have made a data entry error when they're putting the person's name in here. Sometimes if you have multiple owners, the names are cut off and they're abbreviated. You might have a LLC or partnership. That's the owner that should agree to that last transaction, the last deed. And if that's the case, then you're going to want to go on Sunbiz and check and make sure that that partnership or that LLC is active, and then you want to find out who the managing member is of that LLC or partnership, because they're the people that are authorized to sell the house. We've had situations before where somebody did a quitclaim deed, or they put the property in an entity's name, and the person that our agent was dealing with either thought they had the authority to sell the property and didn't know that it had been changed, like a mother that quitclaimed the house to her son and she forgot she did that. Or you might have two partners in a partnership or an LLC that one of them may have authority to sell the property, the other one might not. And to get to the bottom of that, you're really going to need an operating agreement or a partnership agreement to see who has the authority to sell the property. Okay? So all those things, if you're the listing agent, you should be doing all that up front. And hopefully, if you're preparing a purchase offer for a buyer, the listing agent's already done that. But honestly, I wouldn't put total faith in everything that's sitting in the MLS because, you know, sometimes agents aren't as thorough about checking who they're dealing with in terms of listing properties as they should. So it's just a good thing to go through because you don't want to make the offer and think you have an accepted offer on a property and then find out after the fact that the person that you were submitting the offer to wasn't even authorized to sell the property. Okay, so you should definitely check all that out before you write up the offer. Hopefully, too, you've had a conversation with your customer about overall pricing in your buyer consultation. But when you get to this point where you're getting ready to present an offer, I always think it's a good idea to come back and do a quick CMA. So I would probably, let me see if we can find a quick one here. Oh, down at the bottom, I'm sorry. There is quick CMA down here. There's also another CMA down here at the bottom of the listing. So let's just click on that real quick and see if we can do a quick CMA on this property. I'm just going to use myself. I'm going to create myself in here. Okay, so I'm going to put myself in here. And save it. And then I'm going to honestly, I'm going to go back and do it the old-fashioned way, though. I do it because this tool I'm not as familiar with as I probably should be. But anyway, I'm going to go back and save it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask it for active, pending, and sold within the last 180 days. I'm going to go in here and say within a mile of 3214 Amanda Street in Punta Gorda. The reason why I'm going to pick a mile is because that's typically what an appraiser would do. They'll start there and then they'll work their way out if they need to get more comps to finish their CMA. But you can see right here we have 134 matches because I haven't put any property information in there as far as this property. So this property was built. The things I usually focus on are year built, and again, an appraiser is probably going to do it very similar to this. I usually go about 5 years out on either side. So this was built in 61, so I'm going to go 1956, 1966. I'm going to, in this case now, I'm down to 11 matches already. So that's not a huge number of properties to choose from or to review. If I was looking at like waterfront property, I would be, eliminating any non-waterfront property. If I was looking at a house with a pool, I would be saying yes to a pool. So this one does not have a pool, so I'm going to say no to that and see what happens to our matches. So we're down to 9 matches. So instead of just kind of narrowing it down too much, I'm going to go look at my results. So you can see that I've got 4 active listings, including this one, and there's been 5 properties sold within a mile of this property within the 1956 to 1966 time range. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just do a quick CMA on this property. I'm going to eliminate the subject because we don't really want that skewing the results. And I'm going to go down to, I like to use the stats report just to get a quick look at what I think is going on in the market. So without, now the range of pricing here is really pretty broad. That one looks like there's something going on there that would make it probably not a good comp. So I'm going to go back to my results. And I'm going to take a look and see which one that is. And it looks like it's this one on Coral Ridge, the first sold comp. Sold for, it's a handyman special. So it sold for like $38, $39 a square foot. So I don't really want that messing up my results. Let me just take a quick look at that. This price was $65 a square foot. Selling price, like I said, I believe it was about $38 a square foot. So I'm going to eliminate that one from the mix. I'm going to uncheck it. Then I'm going to redo my stats and see what they look like. Okay, so that seems a little more reasonable. The range of values in the sales is from the low of 82.51 a square foot to max of 134.03 a square foot. And then the average was, I usually focus on the average and the median, and I usually kind of try to gauge that and say that's most likely, that's the range in which this house would likely appraise. Because I always try to look at it as what would an appraiser do, especially if you've got somebody financing the house. Of course, a cash buyer, it's a little bit different. So in my estimation, this house, since it's 1,382 square feet under air, would probably sell, let me get my calculator out. So at 1,382 square feet, so 1,382 times 105.33 comes to 145,466. Okay, so 105.33 a square foot comes to 145,566. Then that same house at 102.39 comes out to 141,502. So in my opinion, that would be the likely range that the house would appraise at. Again, the house is listed for $165,000. We don't know what the listing agent has discussed with their seller, but if you get into a conversation with the agent when you present the offer, you can at least go back and explain to them how you came up with your offer price. And you also can have that conversation with your customer. Now I'm going to go back and do one more thing and take a look at that house that sold for $82.51 a square foot, because that might be skewing it even a little bit further. And if that's the case, that might be another one that we might want to pull out of the mix to make sure that we're not undervaluing this property. So that's the last one there. On Eureka. Usually what I do is go through and look at all the pictures and everything in the houses to make sure I'm comparing apples to apples. I mean, it doesn't appear to be that there's any special circumstances, like it's a distressed property or whatever they, might be going on with this seller. But if I eliminated that one, now of course now I'm limiting the number of comps I've got. So that's not necessarily what I want to. I don't want to limit it too much, but now I only have 3 sales, and now the average price is up to $112 a square foot. So actually $112.93 for the average and $111 for the median. So if I use the $112 a square foot, that is going to give me a value of about $154,784. And based on the sales price, the asking price of $165, an offer in the $155 range would be about 93.8% of the listing price, which is probably kind of in line with what's going on in the market right now. So anyway, not to dwell on that, but to have this conversation with your customer before you're presenting the offer. If they come in and they want you to offer $140,000 or something, I'm not saying I would refuse to write that offer, but I would just try to explain to them that, the likelihood of that being accepted is probably not that great, and they should expect to get some kind of a counter offer. And if that's the case, I would let the other agent know, the listing agent know that, let's try to keep this ball rolling and, come back to me with whatever you think the seller is willing to do to try to get the conversation going. Okay, so that's just a little overview on what I would do once I identified the house that they're going to make an offer on. I go back and do a quick CMA on it, try to narrow it down to the most reasonable range of value that you can, and then share that information with your customers, and then have that information available to share with the other agent once you're going to send the offer over. Now, assuming you did that, you'd want to go into, right now, a lot of us are still using dot loop. We will migrate over to DocuSign in Command, but for this class, for right now, what I did was I went into dot loop and I pulled up our purchase package, which has the as-is contract for an as-is contract on a house. And I just went through and identified this package because we're still seeing more as-is contracts than the general, what I call the general repairs and maintenance contract. If we have time, I'll get into that, the difference between those two contracts after we go through this. But for right now, let's just assume we're going to use the as-is contract. And for anyone newer to the industry or hasn't been through this class, where basically this contract gives the buyer the option to cancel the contract for any reason. They don't have to give some crazy elaborate reason like they lost their job or the roof is leaking or anything. They can cancel the contract for any reason within the inspection period. Okay, so again, we talked about the seller's information in the very beginning of the class. So whatever you found out when you went back and checked the deed, that's who the seller would be. So if it does turn out that it's a trust or an estate or something along those lines, what you might want to do is just check with the listing agent to make sure that they've got the proper authority the person that's going to sign has the proper authority to sell the house, and just double check as to who you should address the offer to. Now, as your buyer, hopefully during your buyer consultation, you found out who the buyers are. Is it going to be a husband, a wife? Is it going to be both of them? Is it going to be a parent? So you always want to make sure you know who the real buyers are on the deal. And that should be part of your buyer's consultation. You should always be asking your customer if they expect anyone else to have any part of the decision in buying the house. Because if you find out that the father is providing the money for this young couple to buy a house, not that he might be a buyer on here, but you want to make sure he's in agreement that they're getting ready to write this offer on the house to make sure the money's going to be available to pay for it. Okay, so just make sure you're dealing with the right people on both sides of the transaction. As far as the street, the address, you should be able to take that right off of the listing information. Or you're on a data sheet, and you should be able to rely on that for the most part, or the property sheet from the property appraiser's office. We talked about the legal description. You should always, I prefer to just cut and paste that into the document or into my loop instead of retyping it, because it's very easy to miss something in that legal description. And then, if you don't have the right legal description, that can create a lot of havoc. Hopefully it would get caught before the closing takes place. But it's better to be very careful about that. So cut and paste, in my opinion, is always the safest way to go. As far as paragraph 1D goes, personal property. There is a standard set of stuff that goes with the house, right? So the range and ovens, and remember, these are all plural now. They didn't used to all be plural. They used to be like just refrigerator, which I think we all interpreted as that the refrigerator is in the kitchen. But then we'd always have a question about, what about the refrigerators in the garage? Now, what this contract says, unless it's changed, is that any refrigerator in the house is going to go with the house. So be aware of that. Make sure your buyers understand that. Make sure the sellers are understanding that if you're taking listings. Anyway, the range and oven, refrigerators, dishwashers, disposals, ceiling fans, intercom, light fixtures, drapery rods and draperies, blinds, window treatments, smoke detectors, garage door openers, security gate, and other access devices and storm shutters. Notice the washer and dryer aren't on here. If there's a water treatment system, that's not on here. You'd have to find out if that's owned by the seller or if it could be leased. Pool equipment's not on here. So if you want to be on the safe side, anything that you think might be of question that you want included in the offer, it should be included on here. And if there's more stuff than you can fit on this line, just make an attachment, call it attachment A or whatever you want to call it, and say, see attachment A, and then list out everything that's included in the house. Especially if you're buying a house that's like fully furnished. If you're doing something like that and there's financing involved, I would advise you to do a separate bill of sale for all that, because it's going to affect the appraisal. If you're paying cash, it's fine to just do an attachment, throw it on the contract, because it's not going to affect the appraisal. Unless they are doing an appraisal, then you have to take it into consideration. But don't do something like I saw an agent do not too long ago. Wasn't one of our agents, but the agent put on their turnkey furnished and didn't document or didn't itemize what that included. And the pictures in the MLS had been taken prior to the sellers removing some of the stuff from the house. So the buyer thought that they were buying everything that was in the pictures in the MLS. Well, some of the stuff wasn't there anymore, like the furniture out in the lanai. So it turned into a big problem, and the deal almost fell apart. But we stood our ground, and we got this buyer to realize that she really didn't have grounds to cancel the contract. So it was able to close. But just be very careful, even when you're taking listings. This stuff's not in the listing agreement. So you have to be careful when you're taking a listing. Don't assume anything is either staying or going. So just have to be very careful that that you know what the seller intends to sell with the house and what is not going to stay with the house. Now, as far as this line goes, this is items that are being excluded from the sale. So there might be situations where somebody has, well, one of the big things we're seeing right now is these flat screen TVs, right? So if something can be removed from the house without creating any damage, I guess you could say it's personal property and it's not necessarily assumed to be staying in the sale. But that flat screen TV is probably mounted to the wall with a bracket that if you took the bracket off the wall, you're going to end up with holes in the wall. So unless you fix it, but you want to be real clear about any of that kind of stuff, whether it's supposed to stay or go. Another thing you can use this line for is if there happens to be, say a guy is a painter, he paints for a living, and he's got a pile of old paint cans sitting in the garage, and your buyer doesn't want to take responsibility for having to dispose of them after they close. So what you can do in here is just say, that the seller will dispose of the paint cans at least 48 hours prior to closing or something like that. And then you can go back over to the house before the walkthrough and make sure they're gone. And if they're not gone, then what I would do is, of course, get a hold of the listing agent. But I would also, if it doesn't look like they're going to get them out of there because maybe the guy left town already, maybe he's already signed off on the closing documents, and the likelihood is they're going to be there when you close, well, then I would go out and get an estimate as to how much it was going to cost to get a dumpster or something in there to get rid of that stuff, and then make a case that you want to withhold some money and keep money in escrow to get that stuff taken care of, so the buyer doesn't get stuck doing it. Okay? Now the walkthrough, Tanya just mentioned about the walkthrough. If I had something specific that I was concerned about, I would probably try to make plans to go over there prior to the walkthrough without my customers and try to resolve anything that's amiss without having to get my customers involved, right? So, but there's going to be times when you get to the walkthrough and the house isn't properly left in the proper condition, like it's not broom swept. They might have left a bunch of stuff in the garage. We've seen all kinds of stuff. They might have taken out something that was supposed to be with the house. So if you have that, feeling in your stomach that something might not be quite right, I would always go over there and try to get things resolved before my customers have to get involved. Yeah, pictures are a great idea. Sometimes what we'll see is if people leave town, or maybe they're not even here, they might stop the lawn service early, or they might stop the pool service early, and then your customer ends up walking into a dirty pool or overgrown grass. Again, if that's the case, I would probably try to get over there a couple days before closing and try to get those things resolved before you actually get to the closing table. And before I have to go over and with my customer and deal with that kind of issue with their involvement. If you can
let them know when the garbage pickup is. New buyers never know when the garbage pickup is.
That's a great idea too. Like when you're helping your buyers on the purchase of the house, try to get all the information for them about, changing the utilities, what the service schedule is for garbage pickup and recycling. Just try to have all that information together for them so that you're providing a higher level of service and they're not scrambling to get that information after they're already moved in. Now, we did talk about the purchase price. We talked about, educating your customer on what the likelihood of the prices in that community are selling for. So anyway, whatever you and your customer decide to make the offer, that would first line, the purchase price is what you would put in there. And then the second line is for your escrow deposit. Most of the time, what I do is I use this box. It says it'll be made within, and I'll usually put like 3 days from the effective date. So I'm not taking people's money and then having a deal that doesn't go anywhere and I'm holding somebody's check. So I usually use this box that says do it within 3 to 5 days of the effective date, depending upon what their travel situation is, what their banking situation is. Especially if they're like from out of country, that might take a little more time if they don't already have the money in country to get it to the closing company. And also, if they have the money tied up in some kind of investment, again, you should be talking to them about this stuff at your buyer consultation. So it shouldn't be a surprise to them that they have to come up with this money within 3 days of the effective date. The escrow agent, you should know who the escrow agent is expected to be when you're making the offer. It's as simple as talking to the listing agent and asking them if they're paying for title, who are they planning on using for closing. If it's somebody that you're comfortable with, then sure, go ahead and use them. If it's somebody from out of town, I've often put the money, Suncoast One Title will hold your escrow money all day long, even if they're not closing it, just as a benefit to our agents. But you should fill in
who the escrow agent's gonna be.
And phone number.
Yeah, you should have all this information. You add address, phone number, email, fax, and that should be on the contract.
I think if you have the buyer, your company should, escrow company should hold the earnest money deposit, because if you give it to the seller's agent, and then if there's a problem, and you're trying to get it back, it could be a lot more difficult, because it's in the seller's broker's escrow,
Yeah.
and now you lost control of your buyer's money.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think if I want my customers to be protected, so I'm gonna make sure the money's going someplace where I'm comfortable with who's holding the money.
The control of the money.
Yeah, so I would agree with that, and like I said, Suncoast Fund will do that for you. If you guys are using somebody else, that's fine, but, you know, you should have a good enough relationship with them, whether they'll be willing to hold your escrows, even if they're not doing the closing. And then, this line B, additional deposit. We don't usually see that very often, unless this first deposit is very tiny, and then we might see another deposit go in, like maybe upon completion of the inspection period or something like that. But just to simplify things, first of all, I probably would discourage you from doing offers with really small escrow deposits anyway, because your buyers are going to feel a lot freer about just walking away from the deal if they don't have
But
a lot of
also
money.
the seller doesn't think the buyer's sincere.
Yeah, the better deposit's going to make the offer look
Even if the
stronger.
offer's lower, they may accept it because it's a bigger deposit,
Right, yeah.
because they think they're serious.
Yeah. So, yeah, try to get your buyers to make a reasonable deposit. I usually say at least 2% of the purchase price or something like that. So if you're looking at a $200,000 house, you know, $4,000 or $5,000 should be doable for most true buyers. Okay? I mean, they're going to get their money back, especially with this contract. He has this contract if they decide to walk away. And even with the other contract, as long as everything goes according to plan, the money's going to get applied to their purchase price anyway. Okay, financing. Please fill out this financing line.
And I don't think they're gonna get their money back if it's ready to close, everything's set, you got a meeting of the minds, and then on the way to the closing, they get cold feet and they wanna back out. Well, at
Right.
that point, they're not gonna get their money back.
Right, and we see that a lot where,
It's called time is of the essence.
yeah, that's true. If the buyer's in default on the contract, they shouldn't get their money back, right?
Right, exactly.
So we see that a lot. A lot of times, especially if there's not a lot of money in the pot, there's no way it's worth going to arbitration or hiring an attorney or anything. So the likelihood is it's probably going to be a negotiated settlement between the buyer and the seller on where that money goes. Because if you
Then
can't,
it can go into an interpleader action, so
yeah, but
it's a
then
big thing,
but
It's small.
if there's not a lot of money there, it's just going to go up in smoke.
right?
Because the
Right.
representatives are going to end up with it, or if you have to pay for an administrative fee or something. So, yeah, just make sure the deposits are reasonable. And as a listing agent, you can always, that can be one of the items to negotiate. That doesn't mean you're locked into what they agree to offer. As far as financing goes, you can put a percentage in there. It doesn't have to be a dollar amount, so that if you get into a negotiation back and forth, if the percentage is going to stay the same, it's probably just as easy to use that, so you don't have to keep changing this number. But you should have a number. You should have a number in all these boxes, whether it's 0 or whatever it is. But, you know, there's this other 0. If there's not an additional deposit, 0. It drives me crazy when I see contracts, not so much from our agents, but I've seen plenty where they have the purchase price, they might have the deposit, and then they just put a number there. And then you go to page 2 and you find out they're financing it. So that's, to me, very sloppy. And we make good money when we close these deals. So we should take a little bit of time and care to make sure we're doing it right. Okay?
Would you like an example of other?
Well, it could be a car, it could be
There you go.
a, yeah, other could be something of value that maybe doesn't,
I had a divorce situation one time where the ex-husband took a promissory note from the wife for his share of the equity in the marital home.
Okay,
So then the ex-husband used that promissory note as a down payment on another property,
okay,
because it was secured by the new house that she bought.
yeah, okay. So if you are
And
doing something,
FHA accepted that
did they really?
for financing.
Wow. Yeah, if
So
you're doing
that's
something,
interesting.
if you're doing something like that, we probably should have a conversation before you finalize the contract. Just saying, because,
But you can get creative.
yeah, you can get creative if you need to. Actually, right now, I'm in a situation where I've got a house I'm looking to sell, and I found out the lender's going, the loan officer could get penalized if I pay off the loan too quick. He'd have to pay his commission back, so I'm trying to work out a deal with somebody where I'm going to shake a short-term contract for deed on the property, which means that I'm kind of carrying the financing, but anyway, but contract for deed means I'm not really transferring the deed yet, but I'm going to give them credit towards the purchase for the money they pay me now when we close in 4 months. And then they'll be able to go out and get their own appraisal. And
That's called a staggered closing.
is that what they call it?
Yeah.
I never heard that term.
In commercial, staggered closing.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there's all kinds of ways to work around situations, but it's better to have a meeting, to have a conversation about what the options are.
Okay, it's time for acceptance of offer and counter offers. You should be talking to the listing agent to find out how much time they think they're going to need to get an answer from the sellers. Because for all you know, their seller could be on a cruise out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, right? And they don't have access to technology quite as readily available. So you should be talking to the listing agent about this. And the main reason for that is because they've changed this contract within the past couple of years that once you pass this time, the offer is deemed withdrawn and the deposit, it doesn't say that the buyer may cancel, which is what it used to say. It says that it's deemed withdrawn, which if you talk to some attorneys, they'll tell you that once it hits that deadline, it's a dead deal, that you can't execute a contract after you pass that date or time.
You can't do an addendum?
Yeah, you can change it. So if you miss this time frame, what you need to do, if you miss this date,
Address it.
what I would do is I would just scratch it out and change it and have everybody initial that new date. Follow me? So the other thing I've often used this for is if I was working with a buyer and a property came on the market and they really wanted the property bad and it looked like it was going to be a hot property, I would also put on here not just a date, but I'd put a time. Like I'd want to say, okay, if I'm making the offer on Thursday, I want to have an answer by 3 o'clock on Friday. And then that way I know I've got another chance, hopefully, if I get that response by 3 o'clock, I've got a chance for my buyer to maybe make a revised offer on the property, so it won't go into the weekend and they won't be doing an open house or something like that.
Well, they won't make it go to midnight either.
Yeah, if you don't put a time, it does go to midnight, right?
Right.
So then, that's why I put like 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock, because I want a chance to
Cut off.
wrap things up before the end of the business day. So that's just something to think about. Closing date. Again, if they're doing financing, you should be talking to the lender about, and you should be talking to the lender about how much they're going to borrow up here on the note, okay? If you're not talking to the lender and you're just going based on a pre-qualification letter, I think you're making a big mistake. I would always want to be talking to the lender to make sure how much they're going to finance, what the expected interest rate's going to be, what the term of the loan's going to be, how much time they need for closing, and where they are in the approval process. You know, have they gotten their tax returns? Have they verified their income? Have they pulled their credit? Because if you've just got a pre-approval letter and they haven't done any of those things, that piece of paper is really not worth much more than the paper it's written on, okay? So, but this is important, the
It's not
closing
our
date.
job to assume.
No, you shouldn't be assuming, right? You should be talking to the people that have the answers that you need. So the closing date, the other thing to check on closing dates are, don't, take a look at your calendars and try to avoid weekends and holidays, because that's just kind of like a rookie, that's a rookie mistake. So just pay attention to your dates. The other thing about closing dates is I try to avoid Mondays and Fridays,
because I think if there's a problem with somebody sending something by courier, if it doesn't get out on Friday, it's going to mess up a Monday morning closing. And if you do a Friday closing, if it doesn't close for some reason, you're going to have to wait till Monday anyway. So I think Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays are the best way to go. And I try to avoid the last week of the month too, just because I think everybody thinks it's great to close like right at the end of the month.
No.
But then you have probably a better chance of something getting delayed there too.
Well, title companies are slammed at the end of the
Yeah, the title companies are slammed at the end of the month, so you're probably better, you'll probably get more attention and it'll be a smoother closing if you're not trying to compete with everybody else that's closing at that time. Okay, so we're gonna go to page 2. So the CFPB, so a couple of years ago, these contracts got updated for the CFPB requirement, which means that the lender has to have the documents to the buyer, to the parties, at least 3 days prior to closing. It says for the buyer, but I would want my seller to see them too. But the buyer has to get the documents to review at least 3 days prior to closing. That wasn't always part of the contract. So if you happen to see a contract that doesn't have that in there, then you can be sure that this is not, it's an older version of the contract. This one was revised most recently on June of 2019. So if the contract somebody's using does not have that CFPB requirements in there, then you should probably draw up a new contract and not.
Want to know another reason that's really important?
What's that?
Because if you don't get the closing documents within that time period prior to closing, the buyer can go to closing and back out at the table and there's nothing you can do about it. Because they didn't get the docs prior to closing. That has happened in the past. So, and a lot of times they don't get the package until it's closing time. But there is that caveat that they could. I wouldn't tell them that.
Well, this says it should be extended, that the closing date should be extended for a period necessary to satisfy requirements provided such period shall not exceed 10 days.
Right.
So, unless it
Right,
exceeded 10
and
days.
that's why they revised that, because that
Yeah.
could happen, and it
Yeah.
has happened.
So unless it exceeds 10 days, I think you're okay.
Yeah.
But if it's exceeding 10 days, then there's probably,
Well, sometimes the
And
attorney
underlying-
will get the package, and the attorney will hold it up, so you have to stay on an attorney too.
yeah, that's
And
true.
remind them that time is of the essence.
Yeah,
the attorney.
if your buyer's wanting an attorney to review these things, what I usually tell them is have them review it before we submit the offer, so that we're not needing to have an attorney's approval of an executed contract. But what Tanya's talking about is if they want to review the closing documents, yeah, they need to make sure they understand that the closing date's the closing date, and they can't be holding up the closing just because they've got other business to attend to. Force majeure, that would be in the event that we had a hurricane or something like that. Doesn't happen very often, but there's provisions in here that say that the closing shall be extended under certain conditions in the event that something happens to prevent essential services from being available. So we did have a situation where we had a buyer who was up in Virginia, I think, where they were having flooding, right? So down here we were fine, so we could have closed, but they couldn't get their money sent down from Virginia. So that was a learning experience for me, because when we think of this, I think a lot of times we think of, oh, well, the property's here, so as long as the property's not being affected, this wouldn't come into play. But the fact of the matter is, it affected the buyer back home where they were from. So that did come into play, and it closed, but this was the clause that we used to keep the thing under contract. Okay? Occupancy and possession here. So, first thing I'll tell you is, if you can avoid getting into a situation where somebody's either the buyer's going to occupy the property prior to closing, or the seller's going to stay post-closing, try to avoid that at all costs, because there's just so many pitfalls you could run into. Somebody could
somebody could get hurt, there could be damage to property.
Well, what happened to me is I was supposed to close September 15th, and they let me move in October 15th, and they gave me possession prior to closing.
Well, that's because they couldn't close, right, because there was some,
Well, when we're all set to close on the 15th, my mortgage is approved, everything's good to go. The seller died 2 days
Oh,
before
there
the
you go.
closing, and this is November, and it's
Right.
still tied up.
yeah, so it's,
So that means I have to requalify for the mortgage,
right,
and I'm responsible for the property,
right.
and,
Yeah, if you're
and
gonna,
my costs and everything could change.
right. Yeah, if you're gonna do either of these pre or post occupancy, there is an addendum that we'll look at later, but at the same time, people don't like to hear this, but they really should have a lease drawn up to cover the
Well, they
circumstances.
did put a lease in it, but they had the lease expired, September 15th, and they were supposed to close.
Yeah.
So now I am a tenant holding over.
Yeah, so that's a perfect example. So like if I was the one that was drawing up that lease, I would have put some provision in there, what
The
happens.
attorney didn't,
Yeah, well,
he did me a
that's-
favor, but.
But I would have put some provision in there, because that's what you really want. These agreements are all set to address the situations.
And I owe no rent.
Right, so,
That's okay.
yeah. So in some circumstances, like Tanya's, that's unavoidable, right? The guy died, what can you do about that? But if you can manage the situation such that you don't have to get into this pre or post occupancy, I would try to do
It's a
that.
mess.
Yeah, I would try to do that at all costs. If you are buying the property, if they're buying the property as an investment property and there are leases involved, you are entitled to get it, you should be getting a copy of that lease. And then there also, the seller should be providing you with what they call an estoppel letter, which is basically the tenant signing off, confirming that the terms of the lease are accurate. Like how much they have on deposit, security deposit, what the rental rates are, what the term of the lease is, what the escalation clauses are going forward. So that way you're not just relying on somebody giving you a piece of paper and you think it's accurate and then it might be fraudulent, right? So you want to make sure the tenants are on board with what's going to happen if they're going to be staying behind. If they're occupying it and you're buying the property, like after they move out, I would definitely not schedule closing for probably a week after they're supposed to be out of the house. So that gives you time to go in there, see what the condition of the property is, make sure they are gone, and then have the seller clean up any problems that might exist. Because tenants, you know, you never know what their mindset is when they're moving out of a house and possibly leaving the area. So whenever you have tenants involved, it's just another thing you have to prepare your buyer for. Okay, so assignability, I usually use the middle one, may assign but not be released from liability under this contract. The reason why I do that is because they might want to put it in LLC. Sometimes you're dealing with a husband or wife and the spouse isn't readily available to sign the offer, but they might want to add them on prior to closing. I just think that gives the buyer more flexibility, and I don't know of many sellers that are going to allow them to be assign the contract and then be released from any further obligation. I mean, I would never agree to that if I was the seller. But from a buyer's perspective, may not assign this contract, I always want to give them some flexibility in case they want to do that. If you're dealing with a foreclosure or short sale, you're not going to be able to assign it. So you might as well just go with that if you're dealing with a foreclosure or short sale. And financing. Again, you should be talking to your lender. You should have already spoken to your lender because you need to know, okay, is it a conventional loan, FHA, VA, or some other, could be a USDA. You know, we have these standards and says, you know, if you don't have loan approval within 30 days after the effective date, I don't know why we don't fill that stuff out. I know there's a standard, 30 days if it's left blank, but why not just go ahead and fill it out and be thorough? And then I always usually put fixed I want my customer to be able to get a fixed rate, an interest rate on their loans. That way, if for some reason the situation changes and they can't lock in a fixed rate, they're not subject to taking some adjustable rate that might not be a good situation for them. I also want to be talking to the lender about what he expects the initial interest rate to be. I don't want to give too much room for the buyer to have to take a higher interest rate than what they were expecting. So if you don't fill this out, we were seeing at one point in time when the economy was in a state of flux, like if there was some kind of international incident and
18%,
yeah, it could spike up. We were seeing rates spiking up 5-6 points in one day. So if you don't put an interest rate in there, and I'm your customer, I'm going to be real mad if I have to go through with this contract at a 8% interest rate when I thought I was getting a 4% rate.
and then they have a choice.
Yeah.
Where it says other there, could you put purchase money mortgage in there?
Well, I think there's a purchase money mortgage. You could. Yeah, what I usually do is if it's going to be
Because
a
it would be all the same at the top if it's a purchase money mortgage, because that's your down payment, the rest is the terms, you got the terms in there.
yeah, a lot of times if I'm doing a purchase money mortgage, I'll usually put it on here and
Right.
and I'll say see additional remarks or something like that. But you could. There's a form too for owner financing, an addendum,
Okay.
so we can take a look at. But anyway, fill all this stuff out. You're not doing your customer any good if you're just being sloppy and lazy and not filling this stuff in. And then again, the buyer should make application for financing within the standards 5 days. So if for some reason your buyer's in a situation where they're gonna be traveling or something like that, and you leave this blank and they don't get their application in within 5 days, you're putting their deposit at risk. Like Tanya said, that then I would make the case that they didn't use good faith and make a diligent effort to obtain the loan. And then if they wanted to cancel,
Too bad.
I'd be holding back their deposit. And I might not get it all, but
But the seller took the property out the market,
Yeah.
and so you've harmed the seller.
yeah.
So try and get it back.
So-
The seller has a good leg to stand on.
Yeah, so be thorough. We've used this many a time when we had a seller who, like say the buyers changed lenders midstream and they didn't tell anybody that they did that. So now all of a sudden, they can't get their financing approved on time. And we get down to the end of the wire and now they want to extend the financing period. Or they want to get out of the deal because they're saying they can't get the financing approved in time. We've used that quite a bit and said, well, no, we're not going to release your deposit because you didn't make a good faith and diligent effort to get the loan approved. They're supposed to keep you informed about what's going on with the financing throughout the loan approval process. So just be aware of that. If you're working with the buyer, make sure they understand that if something changes regarding the financing throughout the financing period, they need to keep you informed about that because then you're supposed to keep the other agent informed too.
I would highlight that in yellow and say, this is what you have to
Yeah.
continuously pay attention to.
Yeah, like we've seen customers who have gone out and, they have those deals where you can buy furniture and no money down and then no payments for a year.
Right. Now they're.
That's the worst thing you can do to affect your credit. So don't do that. I had a customer one time who they had a lease on a vehicle and the vehicle lease term came up for renewal and they renewed, they turned that car in, took out another lease, payments were exactly the same. The only difference was now they didn't have 6 months left on the lease or 3 months. They had 3 years left on the lease.
Oh, because that 3 months wouldn't count, really.
Well, what happens is,
Against their debt ratio.
yeah,
But 3 years would
yes.
against the debt ratio, so they shot themselves in the foot.
It only affected their credit score by like 5 points, but they were right on
The edge.
an edge between being able to get the best rate and the next best rate. Well, that 5 points threw them into a different category and they ended up paying
I think, an extra 0.5 point interest on their mortgage. And that's can add up over a long period of time. So make sure your customers aren't doing anything kind of crazy during the time that they're supposed to be getting the financing.
Well, they're not in the business, we are, that's why we're
Right.
here.
Yeah, that's our job, to make sure they understand what to expect and that they're doing what's in their best interest. But they won't know unless you tell them. Okay? So anyway, basically all this language about the loan approval is they need to make a good faith and diligent effort and get everything to the lender that they need to make a decision. If you start getting down to the wire on the loan approval, again, you should be talking to the lender, the loan officer, and you and the loan officer should be talking like, okay, what are you waiting for? I mean, have you gotten all the tax returns? Have you verified their income? Have you pulled their credit? If you have done all those things, what else is out there that maybe we can help the buyer get together? And if you're getting down close to the extension or go close to the end of their financing period, don't wait till the last minute to let the other agent know that there's a problem, because it's probably going to blow up in your face. I would just try to get as much information as I can about what's going on with the buyer's ability to get the financing approved, and keep the other agent apprised and kind of set the stage for, hey, we might need to get an extension on the financing. But don't wait till the last minute and then just spring them on them, because that's never going to be well received by anybody, okay? That's why you got to be on top of this. And if you can't, if you're too busy to keep track of all this stuff on your own, then I would suggest talking to somebody about getting some administrative help. Come talk to David or I about helping you get some administrative help. Okay? Because you don't really need to be spending all your time doing all this stuff when you could be out getting more business.
Stop there. We have assumption of existing mortgage. There are some mortgages out there that are assumable.
Right.
The question is it a formal assumption or simple assumption? And most real estate agents don't pay any attention to that. That makes a big deal.
Whether or not the seller walks away.
Well, yeah, if it's a formal assumption, then the buyer has to qualify on their own credit and their own merit. So then the seller is released from liability, which is called novation.
Right.
Released from liability. But if it's a simple assumption, the seller is not released.
Right.
And sometimes there's VA or old FHA loans, believe it or not, that are simple assumptions.
Right.
So when you say assumption, what are you saying?
Right.
So it says right of terms. You, as an agent, must find out if that's formal or simple.
Yeah, and
That's going to make a big deal when you get to the table. If
Yeah.
somebody wants to assume.
Right, and most agents probably don't do a good job of finding that out when they take listings.
Right.
So,
Well, they were never taught. They had it in real estate school,
right,
but not in the street.
yeah. Now, we haven't seen many assumptions just because interest rates have been so low. Most people are going out and
But
getting their
they're out
financing.
there.
But they are still out there. So if you do have an assumption involved, what Tanya's saying is not all assumptions are going to just let the seller walk away scot-free and not have any liability
So if
potentially
the
in
buyer
the future.
doesn't make the payment, then the lender can go back on that seller.
Yeah, so just be aware of
Because
that.
you didn't do your homework.
Yeah, if you
Then who's
don't,
going to sue you? The seller.
yeah, because the seller will become liable for that
Right.
payment. So if you are taking a listing and the seller tells you it's assumable, you need to get a copy of the loan documents, and you probably should be talking to the lender to find out what exactly the terms of assumption
The
are.
seller will give you you get an authorization from the seller to talk to the lender, then you get it in writing from the lender, whether it's formal or simple. Have that as part of your closing package.
Okay. Now, as far as purchase money note and mortgage to seller, that's what Tanya was talking about earlier. There is an addendum for that. That's like owner financing, right?
Yeah.
So if you get into that, the title company can prepare the note, and they can prepare the mortgage. My personal experience is that I probably would have an attorney do that instead of the title company. I just think the attorneys are a little more thorough in preparing those documents. At least that's been my
Well, you
experience.
get a deed there also, but yeah.
Yeah. So nothing against title companies, I love title companies, but when you get into some of these situations, I think there are cases for bringing an attorney into the picture. On both sides of the transaction, buyer and seller. Because you don't want to be giving them legal advice, that's for sure. Okay, closing costs. I mean, this is pretty cut and dry when you're talking about the seller. Of course, they're going to have the doc stamps on the sale. Depending upon where the property is, it's going to determine what's customary as far as title insurance and the fees related to the title. In Charlotte County, it's still customary for the sellers to pay for title. In Sarasota County, it's customary for the buyers to pay for title, but it's negotiable wherever you go. So
There's no law.
No, there's no law, so you can negotiate that one way or the other. If I was dealing with a foreclosure or short sale, or I was dealing with an agent that was from like the East Coast of Florida and they were going to use a title company out of the East Coast, I would probably be suggesting that my buyer pay for title. Because again, like we talked about earlier, I'd rather have more control over that situation. I had a buyer that bought a short sale back in the recession, and we let the seller pay for title. Actually, it was a foreclosure. And SunTrust Bank was the owner of the property. They were selling it to us. They were using a title company over on the East Coast, or an attorney on the East Coast, to close the deal. And my customer went through all this extra effort to get their money down here by Friday afternoon. The wife flew down from New York, moved her trip up early to be able to get down here for closing on Friday. Everything was done except the bank, whoever was supposed to sign off on the deal from the bank was on vacation, and they didn't find somebody else to step in his place and sign off on the contract. So my customer had to live in a hotel for almost a week before we could get permission to let them into the house. So I learned my lesson the hard way. So ever since then, I've always had my buyers pay for title if we were dealing with a short sale or a foreclosure. And then the title company can deal with the closing agent on the other side of the transaction. So don't be fooled into thinking that you've got to go through the bank's title company. You can still use your own title company. So a lot of this stuff is pretty standard. So again, if you're going to do something other than what this portion of the contract says, a lot of FHA deals right now are asking the seller to help pay for a lot of these costs on the buyer's side. So typically, 3 to maybe 4% is usually kind of the upper limit on how much money you can expect to get from the sellers.
There's one that's missing there, it's origination fee. They don't have that on there. If you're doing FHA, a VA, the seller has to pay the origination fee. Well, you got other there.
Yeah, so if you are looking for the seller to contribute towards the buyer's closing costs,
Know what they are.
I would say you should be talking to the lender, find out how much money the lender is comfortable asking for. You shouldn't ask for too much, because if you ask for too much, it's likely you won't be able to use the whole credit up, and then that money might just go back to the seller.
Well, the title company can tell you what all those fees are, then you can go to the lender knowing what the fees are.
Yeah, most of the fees for the buyer side are going to be mostly loan oriented. You're going to have some doc stamps if they're borrowing money,
Right.
and you can calculate that. If it's in a homeowners association, you can pretty much find that out. But the title company, should be able to do you pro forma closing statement to see what the costs are going to be. But you should be having that conversation with the lender too.
Right.
So title insurance, again, it says 15 days if left blank, or 5, depending upon whether it's a cash or a financing deal. Figure out which it is and put a number in there. There's no reason why we shouldn't be filling these contracts out. I wish they would take those
those stopgaps away, then we would probably pay more attention to what these contracts say. So again, anybody can pay for closing anywhere. It's negotiable, but in Charlotte County, it's still customary for sellers, and for Sarasota County, it's still customary for buyers to pay for the title, and then you get to pick who the closing agent's going to be. Survey. When you're taking a listing, you should always ask if the seller has a survey for a couple of reasons, because the contract calls for the seller to provide it if they actually have it within 5 days. And also it might save a little bit of money on for the buyer not to have to go get a new survey ordered. But
Also check the legal description on the survey. It could be typed wrong, like 1/4 of the northeast corner. It could be actually northwest, but they typed it wrong. And survey's wrong. So always double check your legal.
so check the legal on the survey to the legal on the deed, the property description or the
Right,
property
double
record.
check always that
Yeah.
if somebody typed it wrong, 1/4, it should have been 1/2.
Yeah.
That's a big deal.
Yeah, the legal is probably the most important bit
Right.
of information on this
Right.
whole thing.
Exactly. I had one in the city of Flint. It's a lot in black,
Uh-huh.
but 3 sales prior to that, it was typed wrong, and the back corner of this lot was missing. So,
Oh, wow.
and then they were ready to sell it. I said, you
Yeah.
can't sell it because that's missing. So I had to go back, and luckily the lawyers were still alive, and get a correction deed,
Yeah.
3 correction deeds back
Yeah.
to go forward.
Yeah, we just had, Maggie had a situation like that where 3 transactions prior, there was an easement on the property, and then all of a sudden it disappeared on the
Right, yeah.
deeds.
See, that's a big deal.
Yeah, it almost messed up the whole transaction. So yeah, surveys, I think,
You gotta be a detective in this business.
yeah, so surveys and title insurance, if you have customers that think they don't need a survey or title insurance on their property that they're buying, even if they're buying it from their uncle or the brother or somebody, you don't know what happened before that person owned the property. So you can't just say, well, I know Bob didn't do anything to the property, or I know nothing's changed in the past 2 years,
No.
because it might be something from the past. And if you have a break in title is what they call it, if there's a gap of time where there wasn't any title insurance, then you're accepting responsibility for everything that happened prior to the last time there was title.
Chain of title.
Yes, the chain of title. So if your customer's not getting title insurance, that's really foolish. And surveys, I think, are just equally as important, because you don't know. You might have Maggie's situation, they had a driveway that was on the neighbor's property, so everybody thought the driveway belonged to that property, but it actually was on the neighbor's property.
Or it could have been a joint driveway and it was done
Yeah,
wrong.
Right. Yeah, so there's all kinds of things. If you're not getting surveys done and title insurance done, then that's a big mistake. So I would encourage your customers to do that every time. All right, so we talked about surveys. Home warranties. Okay, everybody knows we're supposed to be offering a home warranty to every buyer and every seller we go under contract with. If you're taking a listing, you should be getting that buyer-seller disclosure form signed. It's this one here, seller and buyer disclosure. It's a little bit redundant of a lot of the stuff in the contract, but it's a kind of a reminder to have that conversation with your customers. And actually, if I was working with a buyer, I'd be pulling that out at the buyer's consultation, so you're not pulling it out at the time you're sitting down to write the offer.
I have a seller right now that has a home warranty on a vacant house they have, and it's transferable
Yeah.
to the new buyer.
Yeah, that's the other point for home warranties. For $50, a seller can add the home warranty onto the property, and it'll cover it during the term of the listing. And most warranty companies, if the house doesn't sell for some reason, they're not going to go hunting after the guy for the $50. But if they are going to add the warranty on, they'll take the payment at closing. So it's not like they have to
This
come
is
out.
one they had for over a year.
Yeah, so
And
they
they've
must.
extended it
Okay.
another year.
Yeah,
So the
that's,
buyer gets one already paid for
yeah.
that they've had.
Yeah, so you should definitely be talking to both your buyers and sellers about home warranties. And like Tanya said, if they put a home warranty on it, they can keep renewing it too. You can put a home warranty on a house almost any time you want.
Right.
But the best time to do it is either when you're selling or when you're buying a property. And it's a good selling feature too. It's a nice little bonus for a buyer to get a house with a warranty because it gives them a little more comfort. The other thing it does for them too is they might not be as picky about some minor repair items if they feel like there's some protection there. Like if the home inspector says, well, there's limited life on the air conditioning system, or there's limited life on the roof, or there's the hot water heater. It might give the buyers the comfort that they know there's some protection for them in the events one of those things goes bad. Especially if the house has been vacant for any period of time, I would almost insist that the buyers put a home warranty on it when they buy it, because if it's been sitting vacant for a while, there's a good likelihood that the water heater is going to spring a leak. Some of the plumbing fixtures are going to start, they might be deteriorating and they might spring a leak. They're the two most common things that I'm aware of that, I would probably want a home warranty for. So yeah, vacant houses for sure, I would encourage my sellers and buyers to put a home warranty on before, at the time of listing actually. But if the buyer's not getting it from the seller, you can always ask for it too. Put it in the contract that the seller's going to provide a warranty. Special assessments, just want you to make sure you understand that special assessments are from a public body only. That doesn't relate to condominiums or homeowners associations. So if you are dealing with a house that's either a condo or a house that's in a homeowners association, you should be get all the documents for the condo or homeowners association up front, including minutes of any recent meetings in the last year. Because if there's been any discussion about an assessment, you want to know about that when you're taking that listing, and then you want to be able to pass that information on to the buyer when you get an offer.
I had triple closing many years ago, and I went to the city, and there was an old sewer assessment with a 42-cent balance. And I caught it.
Yeah.
But that 42 cents, could that be a problem down the road? It could.
Yeah. I mean, if God forbid there are penalties.
But see, that you have to go do your own homework to make sure that there isn't anything recorded with the city or the county that would affect that property that's not showing up.
Yeah, I mean, we're not
But
really
on the title
obligated.
search, you can't guarantee that that title company is going to go do the work you should be doing to make sure.
Yeah, I mean, we're not really obligated to be private detectives, but if you can easily go out and seek out some of this information, you're much better off finding out about it up front rather than finding out about it.
Well, then they're
the
going to
day of
refer
closing.
you as a superior agent.
Yeah, no, it's higher level of service, but if you do go seeking that stuff out, like let's just say in your situation, what I'm going to tell my buyer or seller is, hey, I got this information from Sally over at the city. Here's her number. Why don't you call her and see if you get the same answer that I got? Because Sally at the city might have given you the wrong information, right?
True.
So, and you don't want your buyer or seller to use you as the voice, the last voice that provides them that information, in my opinion, because you might have gotten the wrong information from the person you talked to. You might not think of a question they might have that will come up during that conversation. So even though you might be providing them with information, whether it's something related to the zoning or an assessment or insurance on the property, anything related to the property, I would always defer the final voice to whoever the proper person is, whether it's the insurance agent, somebody at the city,
For a long
the
time.
surveyor, the inspector, any of that kind of stuff. I wouldn't want to be the last
voice that explains something to my customer about any of that stuff. Okay? All right, so if you're
Yes,
using...
you can red flag it, that's all you're doing.
Yeah, you can just bring it to their attention. So, but if you're taking a listing, you should try to do that up front so you don't get any surprises at the back end. Especially with the homeowners associations and condo associations, get all that information from the seller up front because it's so much easier to get it and then have it available when you get that offer. You can even put it as an attachment on your listing in the MLS. Then that way you're not scrambling around when the offer comes in, trying to get all that information, because the longer you wait to get it to the buyer, it gives them that much more free time to look at the property to see if they really want to go through with it. Okay? And so similar to the assessment thing, permits are another thing, that especially now that Charlie's, about 15 years behind us, there was a lot of work that was done after Charlie that might not have been done with the proper permits, or the permits might have not gotten closed out. So you might have some open permits out there. So again, you can go to the building department. Most building departments have a place where you can go and look up the property and look for any permits that have been done. And I would actually pull the list from that site and put that in my file. And then that way, like if the roof was replaced and there's any questions about it, you can say, well, there's a permit pulled here at 2004 or whatever, and it was closed out. But some people might not realize that they do have open permits on their house, right? And
Or some work done without a permit.
yeah, so that's another thing. If you walk into a house and they're telling the seller's telling you it's a 2,000 square foot house, and you can tell that the lanai's been enclosed or the garage has been finished, and the property record on the property shows like a 1,500 square foot house, and they're telling you it's a 2,000 square foot house, there's probably a pretty good likelihood that there was some work done without permits. And you want to probably get that resolved for a couple of reasons, because if your buyer buys that property without that being addressed, then they could be responsible for any potential fines or
have to tear it down because it wasn't permitted.
Yeah, or have to tear it out. The other thing is too, if they're getting a loan, the appraiser's not going to give you credit for that square footage if it wasn't permitted. And then it's probably going to be an appraisal problem, right? So if you see that kind of stuff happen, have that conversation with your customers up front rather than wait until it blows up during an offer negotiation. Mold is naturally occurring. If you're using that disclosure, we talked about the buyer and seller disclosure, it'll cover a lot of this stuff. And if you're bringing that to their attention up front, it won't be as lengthy a conversation when the time comes to write up an offer as it would be if you didn't have a conversation with them up front. So I would be using that seller and buyer disclosure at the time of my initial meeting at the listing appointment, or when I'm doing my buyer's consultation. Not wait until I'm sitting here with this contract in front of me. And that's the reason why some of the stuff in there is a little bit redundant on the contract, because you should need to be setting the expectations for your customers up front and not leaving everything to the last minute. Flood zone elevation certificates. This is an area that, most of Florida, a lot of Florida is in a flood zone. Some people would tell you that the entire state's in a flood zone. I would never advise my customers not to get flood insurance if they ask me about it, but what I would be doing is putting them in touch with an insurance agent and give them a couple options to discuss this with. If there is flood insurance on the property, again, if you're taking the listing, get the elevation certificate up front, because that can be helpful when a buyer's coming to look at the property. If they can't find their elevation certificate and they do have flood insurance, then their agent should have a copy of it, and they should be able to provide you with a copy of the latest elevation certificate. Now, I will tell you, a lot of the rules about this has changed over the years. So they might have an elevation certificate from 10 years ago that might not be any good anymore, and they might need to get a new one. And if they're going to be getting a survey done, the best time to get that done is when the survey is being done. Energy brochure. We're all supposed to be providing our buyers with a copy of the Florida Energy Efficiency Rating information brochure. Again, that's addressed in that disclosure. The energy brochure is in .loop, and we will make sure it's available when we go over to DocuSign. But just so you're aware, you could just send that to them electronically, so you're not printing out a bunch of paper. So that's something to think about. But it should be in a package that you provide the buyers either at or sometime before they're writing up an offer. I would probably go over that, give that to them either in person at the buyer's consultation or send it to them in advance of that so they can look it over beforehand. Again, lead-based paint, pre-1978, we have to have lead-based paint disclosure, okay? That's an addendum that we'll look at a little later if we have time. So this is one that I think confuses a lot of people if they look at it. Homeowners Association Community Disclosure. Buyer should not execute this contract until buyer has received and read the Homeowners Association or Community Disclosure if applicable. Again, if you're not getting all that stuff, if the listing agent's not getting all that stuff up front and making it available, then there's tons of offers that get made without that being seen. Honestly, I'm not sure why they have that in the contract that way. I think that's, I mean, it's a great idea if you can get it all before they execute the contract. But again, go back to that hot property that comes on the market on a Thursday, and they're doing an open house on Saturday, and your buyer's anxious because they've already missed out on 2 houses. Are you really going to wait around for the listing agent to get you all that stuff? So
Make it subject to.
yeah, actually, that's why I don't really agree that this should be in the contract, because the addendum basically does give them time to review 3 days after the contract, the effective date of the contract. So in a perfect world, yeah, it would be great to read everything before you make the offer, but in practicality, that probably doesn't happen very often. And whatever you do, don't assume that the information in the listing about the fees for the associations, either condo or homeowners, is correct, because a lot of agents make the mistake of just borrowing that information from another listing, or they might have an old set of condo docs that haven't been updated to reflect what the new fees are.
There could be special assessments there, or maybe the reserve is overabundant reserve, or maybe the reserve is on the borderline of being broke.
Yeah, good point. So yeah, that's why you want to get current information, the financials, you want minutes from meetings, and of course you want the rules and regs.
And maybe they're gonna put a new roof on next year, and
Right.
you're gonna be billed for it, this special assessment.
Right. Yeah, and if
You
they're
need
gonna,
to know that.
yeah, if they're discussing that, that should be documented in their meetings, their minutes from their meetings. Foreign Investment Real Property Tax Act, FIRPTA. This deals with if you have a seller that's not a U.S. citizen and they're selling the property, then the IRS is going to expect the title company to withhold, I think it's 15%, it might be 20 now, of the purchase, of the sales price. Unless the seller has been pre-registered with the IRS. Now what they might want you to do, they might want your buyer to sign off on a certification that says that they're going to occupy the house as a primary residence, that the buyer's going to do that, which I'm kind of uncomfortable with, because if for some reason the seller doesn't sell his or pay his taxes, and for some reason the buyer can't occupy it as a primary residence because their circumstances have changed, they could be on the hook for any taxes that the seller would otherwise have owed. So it says right here, buyer and seller are advised to seek legal counsel and tax advice regarding their respective rights, obligations, reporting and withholding requirements pursuant to FIRPTA. We are not attorneys and we are not tax advisors as far as I know. So you shouldn't be given legal or tax advice. They should be talking to their accountant or their attorney or somebody other than you. Even if it's the title company, you know, if they want to start there, that's fine. Just, it shouldn't be us trying to explain FIRPTA. Seller disclosure. So our disclosure, we should be getting a seller's disclosure on every deal we do. If you're taking a listing, you should be requesting a seller's disclosure.
If you have a buyer, you should be requesting the seller's disclosure from the listing agent. If for some reason the seller refuses to sign it, at least get it documented that seller declined to sign and put that in your file. We need that to maintain our
CYA.
Yeah, we needed to maintain our $2,500 deductible on our E&O insurance, okay? So if we don't get that, we can't produce it, and we have a claim, the deductible goes up to $5,000.
Well, and if there's a lawsuit later, you could be called into court, and why didn't you have it?
Yeah, you should at least have evidence that you've requested it, and if the seller doesn't want to disclose something, that's on them, okay? Now, if you find out something that's going to materially affect the property, and especially if it's not readily observable, and the seller tries to tell you that we can't, that you don't want you to disclose it, you can't take the listing, okay? You need to walk away from that listing. From a buyer's perspective, if you see something in the house that you think might be of concern, I would definitely be pointing it out to the buyers when you're walking through the house. It might turn out to be nothing, and what I would do is I would ask my inspector to pay close attention to anything in the house that I feel warrants a little more additional attention, okay? So now we're getting into property maintenance. So this is an as-is contract. So the seller's not going to be obligated to fix anything. They are expected to maintain the property in the condition existing as of the effective date, which means mowing the grass, maintaining the shrubbery, keeping the pool clean. But they're not really required to make any repairs whatsoever under this contract. So that's why we have inspections, right? So you have your inspection done. Again, this gives you an out, like if the buyer shall have an inspection within 15 days is the norm. If you're going to do anything less than like say 10 days on that, I would make sure I've got an inspector lined up to get out there right away, because you have to have the inspection done, get the results back, and then be able to go back to the seller if you're going to request some kind of concession for some repairs within that 15 days or within that 10 days. So if you're doing much less than 10 days, I would definitely make sure I have an inspector lined up. And again, your buyer really should be choosing that inspector. I think a lot of us make the mistake sometimes of just saying, oh, use Charlie because he's been doing my inspections for years. And then for some reason, Charlie's having a bad day that day, and the buyer and him don't see eye to eye on something. And the next thing you know, who are they going to be pointing the finger at? But you. And again, we need these inspections, or at least proof that we offered them to the buyers in order to keep our deductible to $2,500 and not go to $5,000. So that's in the disclosure as well. So just get into a habit of using those disclosures. So the buyer has the ability to cancel this contract anytime within that inspection period. And again, we talked about that goes till midnight, unless it's otherwise noted in here. So if your buyer gets the inspection report on the 15th day or the 10th day and doesn't like something and the seller's not willing to budge, then you have up until midnight to cancel the contract. If you are trying to negotiate something at the last minute like that, and the seller's not seeming very cooperative, what I've done in the past is I don't usually just fire off a cancellation agreement. If I want to try to make the deal work, but I want to protect my buyer's deposit at the same time, what I've often done, and it seemed to work, is I'll have a conversation with the agent. If the agent doesn't seem like he's not confident that he's going to be able to get the seller to cooperate, what I would do is I would prepare an addendum that says, this is what we would like for the seller to do, whether it's a concession on money or fix something or whatever. And at the same time, I would say, we would really prefer to do this, but in the event that the seller is not agreeable to do that, I've also attached a cancellation and release of the deposit to protect the buyer's deposit. So that's just something that I've done, and I think it comes across a lot better than just threatening a cancellation.
Where it says buyers shall be responsible for the prompt payment for such inspections, for repair of damage to and the restoration of the property resulting from such inspections, shall provide seller with paid receipts for the work done on the property.
Right.
Now, what does that mean?
So if your buyer is having the inspection done, and say the inspector gets a little overzealous, and maybe he spots mold somewhere and starts tearing the wall open, and as it turns out, the seller,
Rips the carpet up to see if hardwood's under there.
yeah, if the buyer's inspector or the buyer damages something during the inspection, the seller has the right to be reimbursed for that stuff, and the work should be done by a licensed, insured individual. So that's where the paid receipts for the work to be done would come into play, to show the seller that the work was done properly. Now, if that really happens, we don't see that happen very often. I haven't seen it happen very often, anyway. What the inspector should be doing is, if they see something that they think requires further investigation, then I think they should be writing up the inspection report saying that I would recommend getting a roofing guy out there to check on the condition of the roof and check for leaks in a particular area. If that's the case and I'm running out of time on my inspections, what I would do is I go back to the listing agent and say, okay, we had the overall inspection done, but I need a little more time to get the roofer back out there to do a closer inspection on the roof. And because as a seller, I don't want to leave the whole inspection period open for a new thing to pop up. But from a buyer's perspective, I would ask to extend it for whatever particular item or items that I need to get more of an expert out there, whether it's a plumber, electrician, a roofer, a structural engineer. That's what I would do, is I would limit that request for an extension to that particular item. Okay, the walkthrough inspection or re-inspection. So this is very specific. It says on the day prior to closing or on the closing date, prior to closing, the time of closing, the buyer or buyer's representative may perform a walkthrough. This doesn't say you can go there a week before closing and do your walkthrough, and which probably wouldn't be smart to do anyway, because if you go too soon and the seller, that would give the seller time to maybe cover something up or fix something that maybe you don't like the way he's going to fix it or something like that. So I would stick to that on the day prior to closing or on closing date. Now, if I feel kind of unsure about something that is going on at the property, like we talked about earlier, like maybe there's a broken down old boat in the backyard, or a car on blocks in the driveway, or the paint cans in the garage, if I'm going to put in my contract that we want that stuff out of the house or off the property, at least, I would say at least 48 hours prior to closing, maybe even longer than that, I'm going to make it a point to go visit the property myself at that time to see if it was done. And then if it's not done, me and the listing agent are going to have a conversation about what the plans are to get it done. And if it doesn't seem like there's any good plans in place, I'm going to be trying to find out what it's going to cost to get that done and have that money held in escrow if it's not done by closing. If my customers,
sometimes it's 1.5 times that amount, just in case.
yeah, you might want to be a little conservative, and Tanya said 1.5 times the expected cost. And actually, as a buyer, if I'm going to go back to the seller and ask for some repairs, especially on this contract, because you're not really required to do it, if it's not going to affect my financing to get the repairs done before closing, I think I'd almost rather get an estimate for what it's going to cost to get the work done and then hire my own guy after closing to do the work. Because then that way, if there's a problem with the work, it's me and the guy that did the work on my behalf. I'm not dealing with some guy that the seller hired and then trying to get in the middle of that relationship. So I personally, I'd rather get the money to do the repairs myself, make sure it gets done the way I want it done. And one thing we didn't talk about, but if you're taking a listing on a house that more than likely needs some repairs, your seller should take care of those repairs before they even put the property house on the market. Because at that point, they could still get their neighbor they could find somebody, a handyman or something, to do the work if they can't do it themselves. It'll probably cost them a lot less money than if they wait until the inspection comes in, and then the inspection is going to require it to be done by a licensed individual who specializes in whatever area of that work that needs to be done. So instead of getting your neighbor who's a retired electrician to take care of some simple electrical work, you're going to end up going out and hiring an actual licensed electrician, which is probably going to cost them a lot more money then. So the seller, this is another item kind of similar to the assessments, and like we talked about the building permits. The seller is agreeing to cooperate in closing out the building permits if the buyer's identified that there are some open items, okay? So that's just something to keep in mind. Also, if you're taking listings, I know it's a buyer presentation class, but if you have a house that has existing warranties or contracts for like pest control or anything, try to get all that paperwork up front so it's available for the buyers at the time they go under contract. It would probably go a long way if the buyers felt a little more comfortable that the proper warranties and everything were in place. One thing I will warn you, we've seen it a couple times now, is that these new construction houses that people go in, they buy a lot, they do a spec house, and the buyer hires a contractor to go up and build a spec house. If that house has been on the if it's been more than a year after that house was completed, and now your customer is buying that house, don't be fooled into thinking that they automatically get a builder's warranty, because we've seen where those builder warranties will run out. And then we had a house where the roof was leaking, and it created a big problem because we found out that the warranty that the sellers thought they had on the house no longer existed, and the builder wouldn't do anything about it.
Isn't it usually 18 months?
I think around here it's a year.
Oh,
I think it's a year, yeah. So just be careful about that if you're dealing with a new construction, but the seller is not the builder. Because
so they have their attorney do a separate agreement where that builder is going to warranty it.
Yeah, you'd want to find out whether or not the builder's even receptive to that.
Right.
They might not be.
Well, let's see why.
Okay, so escrow agent, I mean, a lot of this stuff is just not something we typically have to worry about. Professional advice, broker liability. Again, we're not the experts in all these different fields. So don't think you have to have an answer for everything. If it's something related to legal, tax, environmental, or some other specialized matter, refer them to somebody who deals in that field. Don't try to answer questions that are outside your scope.
We should write the question down and then say, I've made note of your question, and I will find out where you get that answer from.
Yeah, so
You address it so they can't later say, God forbid if there's a lawsuit. Well, she never told me that.
Yeah, so that's a good point, Tanya, thank you. So if you're dealing with your customer and your customer's like, well, who do I talk to about an environmental issue, or who do I talk to about tax? It's okay to have that conversation, but follow it up with a written email, some kind of written communication.
Write that question down right there, right in front of you.
Yeah, and
so they can see you address it. But so it won't come back and haunt you, because it could.
Yeah, but I would follow up with an email too,
Oh, well,
saying,
yeah,
you know, as we discussed,
right,
you know, I've checked into
right,
who a good attorney might be to deal with a land use issue, and these are the top two attorneys that
I've come across.
And to make sure that they know you're the professional that you say you are.
Yeah,
You're walking your talk.
but document it and try to get away from texting this information to your customers. Because as our attorney, our E&O attorney said at that presentation, text information can get lost.
Yeah.
It doesn't always date stamp it, and you want to have as strong a case as you possibly can in the event that this would go in front of a jury or a judge, okay? Or a grievance committee, or a FREC. So just take a few minutes to make sure you're following up your conversations and text with email and just confirming, like say, you did check with the city about assessments, and Sally at the city hall told you that there was that 42-cent assessment from 13 years ago. Follow up with an email to the buyer and saying, as we discussed, please remember to call Sally at 629-5200 to discuss the assessment that she stated was on the property. And then that way, that's going to save your butt a lot better than some kind of text or your memory about a conversation you might have had. Okay? Same thing with inspections. Like, don't try to explain the inspector's report to your customers. I mean, what I would often do is I would go through the deficiencies in the report with them, and if there were some deficiencies that were like cosmetic in nature, I might remind them that the seller's really not obligated to repair that. In the as-is contract, the seller's not obligated to repair anything, but we can negotiate things. But I would just go through and I would give some advice and saying, these are the items that I think are something we should ask for. I mean, we can ask for everything, but I think if we can pare down the list to the things that are contractually more important, you might stand a better chance of getting the seller to cooperate than if you're just sending the grocery list of everything on the report. Because the grocery list is typically going to include some things that really aren't repairable, just the inspector's kind of covering his butt, right? So, which is fine, but that's again where you're adding value to the conversation, that you're kind of parsing through what's really warrants a request and what doesn't. Okay, default and dispute resolution. So if your buyer's in default, chances are they're going to lose their deposit. And if the seller happens to know that they have the ability to close because they've got adequate funds, then they might be forced to perform. And if that were to be the case, then the seller might be able to recover their legal fees if they win the case. So just make sure your buyers...
See you later.
Good night. So just make sure your buyers understand what the risk is if they're not performing on the contract. And then if the sellers are in default for some reason, usually what happens is the buyer's deposit is going to be returned to them. If the buyers can demonstrate that the sellers have the ability to correct the situation and perform, then they could seek specific performance. But again, you're talking about getting attorneys involved. Anytime you get the attorneys involved, the costs are going to go up, and there's no guarantee that either party is going to recover that money. So let's try to head off the problems before they get to a point where they turn into law disputes. So they do have, the contract does call for the buyer and the seller to have 10 days after the date conflicting demands for deposit are made to attempt to resolve such dispute. After that time, it says the buyer and seller shall submit such dispute to mediation under paragraph 16B. Actually, typically what happens is the title company will make that determination. And most of the time, it's not in either party's best interest to go to mediation or arbitration, because then you have to start hiring representatives, you have to hire the mediator, you have to hire the arbitrator, And by the time you pay all these people, the money disappears, especially if there's not much money at issue.
And
So,
if you go to court, it's $10,000 a day out the door.
oh, really?
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, if you can, let's try to avoid these disputes at all costs as much as we can, and not waste money on having to hire attorneys or mediators or arbitrators. And the best way to do that is keep the lines of communication open earlier, not later. Okay, again, title evidence, restrictions, easements, all this stuff about title, we are not the title experts. It scares me when I see a title commitment come through and it's just getting sent over to the buyer without any conversation between the buyer and the title company. I would encourage my buyers to speak, and again, in writing, encourage my buyers to speak with the title company directly regarding any questions they have on the title commitment. Okay, you do not want to be the title expert because you're going to get yourself in trouble, all right? So try to avoid doing that at all costs. Surveys, we talked about surveys. I'd recommend a survey every time. If the seller can provide you with a survey and they say no changes have been made, the title company can document that usually, and it can usually be used. Some lenders will want to have the survey recertified over to
Did they have
them.
that earlier?
Yeah, there's some redundancy in these contracts.
Oh, good.
Ingress and egress. Seller represents there is ingress and egress to the property. So that's just, they have legal access to the property, legal right of access.
You have to check to make sure something's not landlocked with
Right.
ingress, egress.
Yeah, every property needs to have some kind of legal right of access. Lease information, again, seller shall at least 10 days prior to closing furnish the buyer estoppel letters. I've had that question before. Who's responsible for getting estoppel letters? It's right here in the contract. And once that information is provided, if the buyer doesn't like what they're seeing in those estoppel letters, the buyer may deliver notice to seller within 5 days after receipt of such information, but no later than 5 days prior to closing date, terminating this contract and receiving their money back. So as an agent, you need to be on top of that and make sure you're getting that information from the other party at least 10 days prior to closing, so your buyer is not getting it, on the 5th day prior to closing. Because then you might not be able to cancel the contract. Although I would say, most likely, if they delayed getting the information to you, I think you probably would have grounds for that. But just try to avoid that gray area. So it talks about liens. Again, the title company should be dealing with that. If you're aware of any liens that you think might be out there, ask the title company to dig deeper on their title search and make sure somebody's doing that. You can't assume like that the inspector or the title company is checking for permits, open permits, liens, assessments. You just have to dig a little deeper, like Tanya said, and be professional. And if you come across something that you're concerned about, bring it to somebody's attention who actually has the ability to address it, and bring it to your customer's attention, of course. Time this contract is calendar days and computing time periods. So again, be careful about when you're picking a date. If you have a time frame, like an inspection period or financing contingency that falls on a Saturday, Sunday, or national legal holiday, that the period rolls over to the next business day till 5 o'clock. So that's the only time where a time is mentioned in the contract. That's why we said all the other periods would end at midnight, but in this particular case, if a period ends on a Saturday, Sunday, or national holiday, it rolls over to 5 o'clock on the next business day.
Force majeure, we talked about that earlier. So that doesn't just have to be in the location of the property. And basically, anytime that essential services are disrupted, delayed, caused, or prevented by force majeure, so it could be hurricanes, floods, extreme weather, earthquakes, fire, or other acts of God, unusual transportation delays, or wars, insurrection, or acts of terrorism, any of those things could be considered force majeure. And if it disturbs the ability of the parties to get access to essential services, primarily meaning it would probably most likely involve funding the contract or getting something signed or making sure the property is in the condition that it was at the time they went under contract. If those things happen, you'll know. But it might not be in the location of the property. Conveyance shall be by statutory warranty deed. Make sure your buyers, well, especially your sellers, make sure they understand that when they close, they're supposed to be gone. There's some areas of the country, I think, that the sellers actually get to stay in the property for some period of time after closing. Is that true in New York? I think it's in New York is one of the places. But some people, if they're from another area, they might think they have time to move their stuff out of their house after everything's signed off on. But actually, everything's supposed to be turned over at closing.
That's why they have a possession.
Yeah, so, if you buy, make sure your seller's clear on that.
And how much rent they have to pay per day while they're there.
Yeah, if they stay over, they might have to pay until they get out of the house.
And it's based on the buyer's payment for them,
Yeah,
including taxes and insurance.
so a lot of this stuff we're talking about here, escrow closing procedure, prorations, that's all stuff the title company's gonna really take care of. Sometimes I know people get concerned about who owns the date of closing. Again, the title company should be handling all that for you. But your customer's supposed to be able to have access to the property for appraisals, inspections, and walkthroughs with appropriate notice. The seller is supposed to maintain risk of loss until closing. If it's a 1031 involved, again, there needs to be a third-party intermediary handling that money, and there needs to be some specific language in the contract. So that's something that you want to be aware of. These contracts are not recordable until it closes. So sometimes people want to try to make a public record of this, but that's not, the contract specifically says you can't do that. If you're modifying anything in this contract, whether it's something you wrote into the contract or added an addendum, that's going to override anything that's printed in this contract. So if you're doing addendums, you should always be trying to use the addendums that are provided to us from Florida Realtors. If you're doing an addendum that needs like free-form language, don't be real creative. Don't be writing a book. Just be very specific and clear about what the addendum is supposed to say. You don't have to be real flowery. And
Yeah, don't write anything that looks like legal language.
yeah, don't try to be a lawyer. Just try to make it simple, clear, and concise. And if you can borrow some language from another document, like another addendum, then borrow that language from the other addendum if you need to. But just don't get too creative, because if you draft it and there's some confusion, you and your customer are going to own it. Really, you're going to own it if it's not to your
You're the
customer's
drafter.
advantage. Yeah.
The onus is on the drafter.
Whoever drafts it has to take more responsibility than anybody else. I mean, a lot of this stuff towards the end of the contract is really, most of it is something that's, in most cases, are not going to happen. And then if something unexpected does happen, then we can refer to this stuff. But a lot of it's really outside our control as well. Again, talk about FERPA again. So there is a lot of redundancy here. So
Yeah, they could probably get that down to 8 pages.
Yeah, I
instead of
know.
12.
yeah, I really would like to do that. So anyway, down here at the bottom, agenda and additional terms. These are all the different types of addendums that are available to us. So you have a condo rider, homeowner association, seller financing, mortgage assumption, VA FHA financing, or FHA VA financing, appraisal contingency, which I didn't add. We are recommending that you add an appraisal contingency on every deal that's conventional financing, or owner financing for that matter. If you are doing FHA or VA financing, the FHA VA financing addendum covers that. On a traditional or conventional loan, the financing contingency in the contract doesn't necessarily protect the buyer from having to pay more than the appraised value. So a lot of people don't like to pay for an appraisal if they don't have to get one, like in a cash deal. But if they're doing conventional financing, they're going to have to get an appraisal. So add this appraisal contingency to your contracts and at least offer it to your customers. If they don't want to get it, they can decline it, but offer it to them to give them another layer of protection. If you're dealing with a short sale, if you haven't done one of those before, we should talk about what that entails, because they can get very complicated and they can take a long time to close. Homeowners and flood insurance. After Hurricane Charlie, we were using a lot of these homeowners and flood insurance addendums because the insurance cost of insurance was getting like out of control. So if you think especially if you're dealing with an older home that's below the current required elevation, it's not a bad idea to use this and put a limit on how much the buyer would be obligated to pay for insurance. And then that way it gives them another out in the event that the insurance comes in higher than expected. The best thing to do is get your insurance quotes while you're still in your inspection period. Give them a couple different insurance agents to go get quotes from them. Interest-bearing account, that really I've only ever seen that come into play on larger commercial deals where there's a lot of deposit money that's on deposit for an extended period of time. So you don't normally see that on these residential deals. Defective drywall, that of course was a big deal after Charlie with the Chinese drywall. Haven't seen much of that lately. But if you think the house was built in that 2000 to 2006 time frame or thereabouts, just be wary of it. And if you think that there might be an issue, it doesn't hurt to put that on there. But really, if you're getting your inspections done within the inspection period and the inspector thinks there might be a concern for defective drywall, you can always get an extension on the inspection for the drywall. The coastal construction control line, that is something that typically comes into play when you're out on the beach area, like on the Gulf frontage. I'm not aware of any coastal control lines along the rivers. As far as I know, that all applies out towards the Gulf area. Insulation disclosure. I've never seen that one used.
Where is that?
Oh,
All those?
yeah, I've never seen an insulation disclosure used. Lead paint disclosure, of course, if it's pre-1978, you need that.
Do you have to put in it R2 or foam or sprayed or?
I think it's more of like the level of insulation.
Yeah.
I've never seen it used. Housing for older persons, of course, if it's a community that is registered as a community for older persons, that should be disclosed in a listing, and you ought to be using that addendum. Rezoning normally comes into play if the property would probably be used for some other reason than what it's for. In a residential contract, it would normally come into play if somebody's buying the property to do something different with it, or to,
Like a nursing home.
it could be a nursing home, it could be somebody that wants to maybe use it for business and
In order to do that, they have to get it rezoned. It could be,
Spot zoning.
yeah, it could be somebody that maybe wants to do a multifamily in an area that's currently single-family home. It doesn't happen, you don't run into it very often in the residential world, but if you do, there is an addendum for it. Lease purchase, lease option. Again, we talked about leases and pre and post occupancy. If you can, if you're doing a lease purchase, you probably ought to have a lawyer get involved in finalizing the contract. You shouldn't try to do that on your own. Pre and post occupancy, again, most buyers and sellers don't want to get into the cost of preparing a lease. That's actually the right way to do it. So again, document that you recommended they get an attorney to draft up a lease, even if it's only going to be for a couple weeks. Because if that seller stays in the house after closing and you don't have some kind of a lease document in place, now to evict them from the property is going to probably be a lot messier than if you had a lease in place. Okay? Same thing with pre-occupancy. If you have somebody moving into a house before closing and they don't close for some reason, you're going to have a mess on your hands if you don't have the proper documentation in place. So just don't let that happen. It's your job to protect yourself and your customer. Sale of buyer's property, that's if your offer is going to be contingent on the buyer having to sell another property before they can close on this one. This is not that uncommon. We're starting to see a lot of this. So if your buyer needs to sell a property, first of all, hopefully they've already got it on the market. Second of all, they've already got it under contract. And if they don't, they're not going to be able to be as strong, they're not going to be able to negotiate as strong if they're trying to buy a property without their property already being under contract or preferably closed. So if you can arrange things so that the buyer's property gets sold before they go under contract with another property, that's the best way to go. But again, this is happening more and more frequently. So if you have to use it, but if you can work it out a different way, I think that would be a better way of doing it. Sometimes what the buyers can do is they can take out a home equity loan or something on the property they're selling and use that money to buy the property they're getting down here, and then they can just pay that off once that property gets sold. Backup contract. So backup contracts, that's where you took a contract with another buyer, and for some reason, another buyer, usually it's somebody that's seen the property in the past, and now maybe their house finally did get sold. So they're coming back now and they want to buy the house, but it's under contract. This would give that second buyer the right to be in first position in the event that first contract falls apart. It's not a bad idea to take them if you're the listing agent, because it would give your seller a lot more confidence to stand their ground if the buyers start wanting to renegotiate some terms of the contract based on an inspection or something like that. So backup contracts aren't a bad thing. It's just that they're not used very often because agents, I think, probably don't like them more than anybody else because they don't want to get tied up in something that they don't know how long it's going to take to close. The kick-out clause would be a clause where you're going to give somebody an option more or less to buy the house, but you're going to continue to market the house. And if somebody else comes along and writes an offer on the house, you're going to give the first buyer, 24 or 48 hours to remove any contingencies that might be on the contract and move forward. Otherwise, you have the right to cancel that, as a seller would have the right to cancel that contract and move on to another contract. So if you have any of these things, especially the backup contract, the kick-out clause, the sale of buyer's property, again, it wouldn't be a bad idea to have a conversation with me or some of the other experienced agents in the office to make sure you're structuring it that's in the best way for your customers. The seller's attorney approval and buyer's attorney approval.
I don't honestly, you don't see them used very often. Sometimes from people from out of state will want their buyers, their attorney, to approve the contract. What I usually
Court
say,
situation, sometimes you have to.
yeah, it could be a court situation, like if the seller has to get approval from the court to execute a contract, that could be subject to seller's attorney approval. Usually most agents are gonna give you that information up front, and but if that's the case, there's no harm in using this. If it's a buyer's attorney approval, I don't know why they just won't get the buyer's attorney to approve it before they submit the offer. To me, it's kind of crazy that you would go under contract and then still want your buyer's attorney to approve it. I don't know why a seller would accept a contract subject to buyer's attorneys approving something, unless it was a really complicated situation. Licensed property interest, I think you all know that if you or immediate family member is buying a property and you're representing them, you should be disclosing that.
Must.
And the easiest way to do it is to either write this, use this addendum, or often if I'm the buyer on a property or the seller, I might just put, licensed Florida realtor behind my name in parentheses, or put it in additional terms. But this is one way to do it, licensee's property interest. Binding arbitration. Arbitration's already addressed in the contract, so I don't really know why you would need to add a binding arbitration. Again, it's one of those things I've never seen used. Miami-Dade County, that's not applicable for this area, and we shouldn't be doing business over there unless we have had a conversation. So now there's going to be other things that come up, which is what you use additional terms for. Might be, like we talked about earlier, it might be about property that is either coming with or being excluded from the contract. It could be that the legal description doesn't fit in the field up there, and you might want to cut and paste it here and say up on the first page, see additional terms. It could be that the seller is granting some kind of credit to the buyer for closing costs. That's a pretty common one to see here. So first of all, if you think you need to put something in here, you should be looking to see if there's an addendum that covers that situation first, and use the addendum if at all possible. If you have a situation that's out of the norm and you need to use these additional terms, again, don't be real flowery. You're not writing a novel, you're just writing what the additional terms are. So if it's the seller's going to contribute $5,000 to cover the buyer's closing costs and prepaid items, that's as much as you need to cover that. So don't get real wordy and creative when you're adding additional terms or when you're writing addendums. So it's 7:10, and we just got through the contract. So I'm not sure that we really have time to go through all those addendums, but we discussed them all. What I would suggest everybody do is sit down, read through this contract. Sit down, and you can take it down in bites. But these standards that are on pages, let's see, they start on page 7, paragraph 18. If you read through the contract, what you're going to find is a lot of these standards are referenced somewhere else in the contract. So if you see where a paragraph references another section of the contract, go read that other section.
Find out why one is different, maybe one word, but that one word can be very important.
Yeah, like I'm looking at one right here. Under seller default, second to the last line says pursuant to paragraph 16. Well, go read paragraph 16 then, because it's going to make a lot more sense if you put the pieces together than if you're just going down the list. Now that one's probably not a great example because it's right above 16, so it's easier just to go from one to the other. But there's other sections in here that talk about, one I think is with the financing, for instance. Well, of course I can't find, okay, not find. Okay, so here, under special assessments, the very last line says, we're talking about prorations, and a lien, which lien shall be prorated pursuant to standard K. Well, go look at standard K and see what that says, so that you understand what it says. If you understand this contract, you should be able to sit down with your customer and confidently go through this contract, and
Especially if they ask you and you go, I don't know. Well, how does that make you look?
yeah, you're gonna look a lot more professional if you can answer their questions. Now, you don't wanna be a lawyer and interpret legal, so if they really,
No, but you can get a copy of it, say, here's a copy.
yeah, I
What's
would,
wrong with having a copy?
at your buyer's consultation, I would provide them a copy of both this contract
Have your lawyer look at it.
and the general repairs and maintenance contract. If they wanna have their lawyer look at it, they can send it to their lawyer.
But you did your job.
But,
And you took the heat off the company, you,
yeah,
the
so,
broker.
I mean, give them a copy of these contracts at your buyer consultation so they can read through them. So when you're sitting there writing up an offer, you're not trying to explain every line in these contracts. And especially if they know, if they understand the difference between the as-is contract and the general repairs and maintenance contract. And really, the main difference between the two of them is, under the general repairs and maintenance contract, there's limits as to what the seller's obligating himself to repair if things come back in the inspection, or if there's open permits, or if there's wood destroying organisms. The seller's gonna be obligated to do a certain level of repairs under that contract, and if the seller's willing to do that, then the buyer can't get out of the contract. In this contract, the buyer can get out of contract for any reason, as long as you're within your inspection period. Okay? But under both contracts, the inspections have to be done, the report needs to be obtained, and you need to report back to the other party within the inspection period. So don't think that just because you had the inspection done, that you satisfied that inspection clause, okay? So I guess we're gonna call it quits for tonight, unless anybody has, you have anything to add?
No?
And then,
That's good.
but if you have any questions, feel free to give me a call, and have a good night.
It gets tiring after a while.
Yeah, I was tired before we started.
I know, sometimes when I was teaching, I had to sit in the car and take a little nap and then go to the classroom and say, ready, camera, action, you know.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's like, man, I don't even want to read this paragraph.
Well, some of those paragraphs, there's so much stuff, and
Well, it's redundant in a
Yeah.
lot of ways.
I think you're right. There could be a lot that could.
But attorneys, when they first started out,